Okay, everybody. Good evening. My name is Paul James. I'm the Director of Development and Publishing for the Knoxville History Project, and our mission is to research, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. I hope everyone's tuning in, and I've already picked up a copy of our literary guide that's been out a few weeks now, Knoxville: A Walking Literary Guide. If you don't have one yet, you can get it at these places around town: Knoxville Visitor Center, that's one on the corner of Gay Street and Summit Hill Drive. Lawson McGee Library has a new stack, Union Avenue Books, and the East Tennessee History Center. And I want to thank everybody actually who supported this. We got a grant earlier last year from Humanities Tennessee through a Sustaining the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan grant, a SHARP grant, which was kind of co-funded through the National Endowment for the Humanities. That really was a great shot in the arm to get this project funded. But also want to shout out for Visit Knoxville, Knoxville Writers Guild, who were our first sponsors to sign up. Friends of the Library and Knox County Public Library, Union Avenue Books, and we got some TO2 funds from the City of Knoxville as well. Hopefully I'm not missing anybody. Oh yeah, Downtown Knoxville Alliance underneath my screen there. So thanks to everybody for our sponsors and funders for this. It's quite a lot of time consuming for Jack to research and write it, even though he's been itching to have something like this out for many years. We have printed 6,000 copies, so it's going to be available for a while. We also have an online version of it in our Engage section of the website. You can find it right here, Knoxville Literary Guide. It's got most of the content, though it's organized very differently. Rather than the printed piece, we do have the bios for all the authors that are mentioned in the guide, but the locations are all plotted on a Google map, so you might find that helpful in other ways as well. You can order a copy from our shop. We just charge 1 cent. That allows us to get it on the online shop, and if you can help us with the shipping and handling, we'll be glad to send it to you if you've not been able to come and pick one up or live out of town. Also put a call out for if you want to do a walking tour with Laura. Saw her yesterday. She had a group of ladies that were hanging around the Catherine Wiley art wrap on the corner of Gay Street and Union Avenue, and she's very busy doing ghost tours. But they're not all ghost tours this week. So check out Knoxville Walking Tours with Laura Still. Thank you, Laura. Also, last thank you is we got a grant through the Arts and Culture Alliance. So this program is supported in part by a federal award through the City of Knoxville and the U.S. Department of the Treasury for this season. So thanks to everyone there. And Jack, it's over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, but I'm grateful to get to talk about this. This project is something I've been wishing to do for a long time. In fact, I first proposed it to another nonprofit back in the 90s when I was a newspaper reporter, and I've been surprised that Knoxville's, the private industry has never produced stuff like this, because most cities in America of Knoxville's age and literary reputation have something, and sometimes several different publications of this nature that you can look at quickly and find out about the literary history of your city or the city you're visiting. This is, as I say, it's been a long time coming for me. I wrote a piece for a Knoxville Writers Guild publication called Voices from the Valley back in 1995, called Excavating Literary Knoxville. A rather long narrative essay about the history of literature in Knoxville, and wrote another one that was even longer for a second book, which was called Knoxville Bound, which came out in 2004. But this is the first time we've actually done a literary guide, and we're pleased to have it out. It's been I've encountered, I don't know whether you all do, but I've encountered people who drive here to see where James Agee grew up, and one of them is described in an essay was Larry McMurtry, who wrote Lonesome Dove. Came to Knoxville one time just to see the city that he'd read about, because Agee had been a big influence on him and his writing. But the BBC came here back in '95 to do a audio documentary that actually won a global prize about Knoxville Agee's Knoxville and how it had changed. Then other people come here to see where Cormac McCarthy grew up and whether the city described in Suttree is a real place. People have come here from as far away as Australia just to see Knoxville and find out that it does have traces of the Knoxville of the early 1950s that McCarthy described. And Nikki Giovanni, of course, has fans all over the place, and she has described Knoxville in some of her early poetry. But all these people, has been a lot of literary ferment in the 20th century, especially in Knoxville, especially the latter half of the 20th century. But it has a lot of precedent, and I like to go back when I talk about things to see what might lead up to this, and what influences might have been here before these better known writers. Back in the very earliest days of the city, back in 1791, we had it was a brand new city. It was capital of the Southwestern Territory. It had no churches. It had very few of the amenities of a city, but it did have a newspaper, the Knoxville Gazette, which was founded by a guy named George Ralston, who was from Boston, Massachusetts, and founded the Gazette. It was a biweekly first. I think it became a weekly later. But his first job was to publish Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, perhaps the most controversial essay, book-length essay, in Western civilization of that year. It was a brand new publication, and he published it in the Knoxville Gazette in serial form. George Ralston is an interesting guy. He died young. An aside, he died in 1804. His widow, Elizabeth Ralston, took over the Knoxville Gazette and George Ralston's role as state printer. And this is very unusual to think in 1804 of a woman being in charge of a newspaper and being the official state printer. But nobody knew how to run the printing press at Knoxville, apparently. And she was, for 4 years, had both of these roles. So she has a place as a pioneer female publisher in America, I think. But also in 1791 is a somewhat murkier literary distinction, and that's that a French nobleman named Chateaubriand came to Knoxville, or said he came here. Some people have questioned it. It's later biographers think he really did come here in 1791, when the city was only a few days old. And was looking around to write a novel. A novel was published in France called Atala, which is about the Cherokee Indians. This is it's interesting that it's not a well-known novel here, but it was in its time, but mainly in Europe. So that's a couple of interesting precedents to what came forward. Knoxville, because it was capital, it was a state capital, territorial then state capital. It was a publishing center, because what does a capital do? They make laws, and they have to publish these laws and other documents, and they have to publish a lot of them because they were publishing law books in Knoxville for statewide lawyers in Chickasaw Bluffs on the Mississippi River. So across the state, a lot of these early law books were printed here. It's kind of a part of our history that we don't always remember for some reason, but we have a few traces of this pretty vigorous publishing industry around, including Paper Mill Road on the west side of town, which was named for the paper mill that was there that supplied these printing presses, as well as it wasn't the only paper mill, in fact, in the area, but it was the best known in the early 19th century. But following George Ralston by some years was a guy named Frederick Heiskell, who had a paper called the Knoxville Register. He was from Hagerstown, Maryland, and he became a kind of an all-purpose printer as well. He printed a lot of books on this Knoxville printing press, which may or may not have been a descendant of the one that Ralston had. But he was an important early printer, printed a lot of, we have some pictures of that, Paul, don't we? Some of his early stuff. Yeah, here's the Knoxville Gazette, Ralston's Knoxville Gazette, kind of the top of the the front page from 1795. And again, Ralston was from Boston. He learned printing there and came down here because it was a new capital. He saw opportunity here. And again, his wife Elizabeth ran the paper for several years before she married and moved west. But next one. Yeah, this is Frederick High School. The guy I'm talking about. He came here from Hagerstown, Maryland, which has several interesting connections to Knoxville, but was a significant printer and also, as you see, mayor of Knoxville for a year. But he printed a lot of books, including some of the very first Cherokee language books were published here. And incidentally, it's notable that of course, Sequoyah, who was from the Monroe County area of Tennessee, was the guy that created the Cherokee alphabet, the only person in American history to have created an alphabet that was used in a language, kind of to make for the first time a Native American language a written language. This was a revolutionary thing to happen. And when the first Cherokee language newspaper, the Phoenix, was published, they sent up to Knoxville for paper because they knew we had a lot of paper here because we did a lot of publishing here. And so it was based in North Georgia, but they ordered the paper from Knoxville. So that is not surprising that Frederick High School published these early books about how to understand the Cherokee language. But also published some novels. There were novels and books of essays, books of poetry. A book called The Scrapbook was published. This is an early history of Tennessee, published here by High School and Brown in 1823. So this is probably one of the very earliest histories of the state. And in fact, I think it probably is the earliest. So this was one of the many books published here in Knoxville. Next one. And this is one of the most interesting books of this year, published, I think, the same year as that history, The Savage by Piomingo. Piomingo was a kind of a legendary Cherokee name, but this is actually, it says a headman and warrior of the Muskokolgee Nation. But the real author of this was a guy named John Robinson, who was a rather eccentric fellow. This book, if it were published today, would be controversial because he's extremely critical of white society and of Christianity as well. And it's kind of fairly aggressively and even outrageously subversive, and you could call it that. But John Robinson is an interesting and one of several kind of mysterious figures of this era. He was when he wrote this book, he was a fugitive from a murder charge up in Carter County. And I think he died rather young of tuberculosis, perhaps. But another guy was published actually a novel called Woodville at about the same time, the very first novel published in Tennessee as well. And he was also, I'm trying to remember his name, but he was also had been accused of attempted murder, not murder, as John Robinson, aka Piomingo, was. But this is a remarkable thing to have been published here. It's tough to find and kind of tough to read, but it's an interesting artifact from this era that shows that they were pretty much wide open about what they were publishing here in Knoxville. Next one, please. This is George Washington Harris, who grew up with this kind of testing of boundaries that you saw in early frontier publishing. George Washington Harris was born in Pennsylvania, I think in the Pittsburgh area. He came here as a boy with his older brother, whose name was Samuel Bell. who was by the way, a jeweler and a metal worker, and is a kind of a well known for having made Bowie knives. Samuel Bell Bowie knives are much valued in the antiques market. But Samuel Bell also became mayor of Knoxville at one time. But George Washington Harris was the younger brother, a half brother, didn't have the same last name, but he came here with his brother and was first apprenticed as a jeweler in his brother's shop, but began doing other things. Began writing his own work in the 1830s and 40s. By the 1840s, he was publishing work in the national press and up in the New York papers, mainly humor. This is something that he loved, humor, especially kind of outrageous and subversive humor. And this was something that he became known for in the 1840s and 50s. And he created a character called Sut Lovingood. As you see that book there, Sut Lovingood's Yarns, was published in 1867 and was a national bestseller. It was appreciated on the West Coast, where a very young journalist named Samuel Clemens was working, and he picked it up and was very impressed with it and said something nice about it in the San Francisco press. But Sut Lovingood's Yarns has had quite a lot of influence over the years. William Faulkner paid tribute to it as the one book he liked in his family home, and he read it and read it again. It's Sut Lovingood, and you can get a general sense of it by looking at that picture there, which is from Daddy's Acting Horse, I think it's called. But it's a typical scene. These are bawdy. They're often involve people losing their clothes. They deal with sex and death and a lot of the things we're not to talk about. But George Washington Harris really, even though he was an elder at First Presbyterian Church, he was completely irreverent about organized religion. At least Sut Lovingood was. He was almost like the American id. He kind of expressed what people feared or suspected or whatever. And he said it out loud and gave people a chance to kind of enjoy the crazy fun of what they were suppressing. But his books are hard to recommend because they're not at all politically correct. But they're always surprising if you do, and they're written in phonetic spelling, which is annoying in a way because it's so annoying that some people have actually written them. But some scholars have rewritten them with unphoneticized spelling. But if you read it out loud, some of these are just really hilarious. A couple of these stories are set in downtown Knoxville. Most of them are out in the country, and most of them in the southeastern Tennessee, which was where Sut Lovingood's home was. But it's a book that's had a long staying power. Sut Lovingood's Yarns, to my knowledge, has never been out of print in over 150 years. It's read mainly by scholars today as kind of one of the bulwarks of American humor before Twain. So this was at the time that George Washington Harris was beginning to write. It was, Edgar Allan Poe was still alive. There were. This is really early in American literature history. Interestingly, Harris, who was a secessionist, was not comfortable in Knoxville during the Civil War. He moved to Nashville, later to Alabama, and maybe later to Georgia. But this book was a big success in 1867. He'd already left town, although Knoxville papers were still publishing his stories. And it's amazing some of the stories that Knoxville papers published in the 1860s. The News Sentinel would not touch some of these stories because they're extremely irreverent about things like about death. There's a story called "Well, Dad's Dead," which is about Sut Lovingood's father, and it's weird, but if you take it in the spirit that he intended it. It's also hilarious. But anyway, this book was so successful that he wrote a sequel to it called High Times and Hard Times. And he was marketing this. He was trying to sell it to a publisher. Knoxville was no longer a big publishing center at this time, but he was trying to sell it to a publisher in Baltimore, and was on his way back home on the train just 2 years after Sut Lovingut's Yarns came out, when he's still kind of basking in the success of this national book, which was, I mean, it was popular for many years after that. And when he had some kind of an episode, apparently a stroke on the train, he was put out of the train. He's 55 years old. He was put out of the train, and the next stop, which happened to be, unbeknownst to the conductor, happened to be his hometown of Knoxville. And they put him in the hotel near the train station, and called in the nearest doctors. And one of those nearest doctors happened to be Harris's brother-in-law. He said, "I know that guy. That's my brother-in-law." And but he died that night, having said only one word, and that was poisoned. And we don't know at all what became of Harris that night. And we also don't know what became of the book manuscript that he had with him. It went missing that night. So it's an interesting mystery about what happened at the old Atkin House Hotel, which no longer stands, but it was over near where the Southern Railway station is now. But anyway, a fascinating guy who had a lot of influence on I mentioned William Faulkner loved the book. Flannery O'Connor loved Sut Lovingut's Yarns. Flannery O'Connor, kind of one of the godmother of the Southern Gothic style, and she actually said that she owed part of her career to Sut Lovingut and George Washington Harris. But also, a lot of scholars assume that Cormac McCarthy owes something to it. And a lot of folks have assumed that Suttree was named for Sut Lovingut. I think McCarthy himself has denied that, but it's an unusual name. Sut is the name Sut appears in Suttree, anyway, it's there are many Sut Lovingut style characters, and especially Harrogate in Suttree, so it's hard to avoid considering that influence. Next one, Paul. All right, another guy who lived just around the corner, and I don't know how many people who study one or the other realize how close they lived together. It was Parson Brownlow, and he had was a contemporary of George Washington Harris. Had very, very different political views. Parson Brownlow was an extremely hardcore Unionist during the Civil War, and stayed here in Knoxville. But we remember him politically for his gubernatorial period, when he was, for 4 years after the Civil War. He was probably our most influential governor in Tennessee history, mainly in pushing through civil rights agendas, and also bringing Tennessee back into the Union very almost forcefully after the Civil War. There's a lot you can say about that political era, and I sometimes have a hard time talking about that. But he was first known, he was a parson just in his youth, mainly circuit riding Methodist preacher. But he was, for most of his career, he was best known as a journalist, a writer, an editor. He came to Knoxville in 1848 to be editor of the Knoxville Whig, which was his paper for a long time. Was a paper that had, even though it was called the Knoxville Whig, it had a national audience. It had circulation in the tens of thousands, even though Knoxville was just a town of about 2,000 or 3,000 at the time. And many people up north subscribed to Brownlow's Whig because they enjoyed his, again, outrageous humor. I keep using the word outrageous, but that characterizes a lot of these early writers, that they just enjoyed saying things out loud that their parents would never have countenanced. And Parson Brownlow was one of those. He wrote a few books. Some of them most of his books are critical of Christians of other denominations than Methodists. And this image that we have is from the Great Iron Wheel Examined 1856. There's a lot of inside jokes stuff here. You need a lot of context to follow a lot of it. But this is basically, this book is a critique of the Baptist faith, and that's. But you can see the guy on the left, and that's kind of the typical Parson Brownlow and the typical George Washington Harris fan. He just enjoying this perhaps uncomfortable scene that these other guys are dealing with. I think this is Graves was a guy who had been accused who'd been accused of slander or something. I forgot the whole story of that, but anyway, Parson Brownlow was so well known that that I talked to a guy who was redoing a house in Maine, an old antebellum house in Maine, and was going into the insulation of the house and found that there were copies of Brownlow's wig from Knoxville in the insulation of that house. But I was interested. I did a newspaper research, newspaper check, and found out that when he died in 1877, his obituary appeared all over the Western world. It appeared in England and Ireland and other places, and especially all over America. Everybody knew Parson Brownlow, who he was, and I don't know whether it's something to be regretted or not. I think so, that Tennesseans today don't know who he is. But who he is such a complicated issue that it takes a long time to get into. But he has I challenge you to read his Wikipedia page, which kind of gives you just a little bit of a sense of how he was. He went through lots of different phases in his life. He went from a hardcore pro-slaver in the 1850s to one of the great champions of civil rights in the South, regardless of his motives and methods, in the late 1860s. So anyway, but he was best known, and he would not have been known if not for this wicked sense of humor that he used in his paper, The Knoxville Whig. Next one, please. All right, here we go. It's hard to believe that these same people overlapped, that all these people, that Parson Brownlow and George Washington Harris and Francis Hodgson Burnett lived in the same small town of Knoxville in the Civil War era. It's mind-boggling almost. But she was from England, from Manchester, England, and a very she was not at all outrageous, but she was very someone who could see into people's manner. She wrote comedies of manners, and she could understand people, I think, kind of in the way that Jane Austen and other people could. She became best known today for her children's books, and they're not really, if you read The Secret Garden, you realize it's not really a children's book. It's a long book with a lot of complexity in it, but children, really smart children, enjoy reading it. But this is one of several books, of course, that she's known for. A lot of her books have been made into movies. I think I once counted 28 or 29 movies that had been made from Francis Hodgson Burnett books, including The Little Fauntleroy, and The Little Princess. The one I knew the best of all, that image you see on the right, is very interesting because it's her memoir of her youth and up to the time that she began publishing. She describes her home in Knoxville without ever mentioning any proper names of the city. Knoxville is called the town. New Market is called the village. But she lived near the town of Knoxville when she began writing her first published short stories. And remarkably, none of them were ever sent back. She had a record that may be unchallenged today for having all of her stories were accepted for publication by national magazines from the time that she was 18 years old. And that's what the age she was when she sold her first story to help her family, because her family was her mother was widowed. They'd come here kind of out of desperation because their factory back in England was failing, ironically, partly because of the Civil War in America, which disrupted the cotton trade all over the world. But But they came here mainly because her uncle was established here and owned a little bit of land. But she spent about a decade or so here in Knoxville, and it was here that she began writing. She wrote a couple of wrote one novel that's kind of expressly based in Knoxville called, although the name has changed, in connection with the Willoughby Claim, which is a comedy, an adult comedy, um, not unlike the work of Mark Twain at the same time. Um, but uh, uh, but also she wrote a book called Vagabondia while she was still here, which which is actually set in Bloomsbury in London, but her son said it was really based on people she knew in Knoxville. And I would love to, if I ever have a lot of time, I'm going to try to figure out who was who and that sort of thing. We know about a few of them, but they actually lived in a house called Vagabondia, Vagabondia Castle down by the river, and it was over near, not far from where the Henley Street Bridge is today. A lot of interesting stuff about that. Our colleague Paul Brown has turned up a lot of stuff about Frances Hodgson Burnett and her time in Knoxville that I didn't know. Fascinating family. I was talking about her the other day because her mother is buried at Old Gray Cemetery, and that's, I think, the only remnant of her time here, because all 5 of her known houses have been torn down for a long time. There's no trace of any of the places where she lived, unfortunately, but her mother's grave still stands in Old Gray Cemetery. Her mother died in 1870, I believe. And that after that, it was just a family of teenagers with no parents who were just kind of living on their own at Vagabondia Castle, kind of a bohemian sort of a clan there. Next one, please. But oh, by the way, before we leave Frances Burnett, we had a recent dedication of a plaque about Adolph Ochs, and they overlapped in Knoxville too. Adolph Ochs, the guy that founded the modern New York Times, they knew each other, Adolph Ochs and Frances Hodgson Burnett, but he was about 9 years younger, I believe. But so they weren't childhood chums, but he was actually working for the Chronicle at the time that Knoxville Chronicle, run by William Rule, at the time that it was publishing dispatches from England by Frances Hodgson Burnett the first time she went back to England after she and her family moved here. She was a young woman and was writing back about what she saw and heard there in the 1870s. So they overlapped and may have worked on the same issue, the same paper. So that's remarkable. Adolph Ochs went on, of course, to found the modern New York Times in 1896, and also the New York Times Book Review, which in itself makes it relevant to literature. But he began his career in journalism on Market Square, and I'm glad there's finally a plaque there, thanks to the Society of Professional Journalists, who got that installed about 2 weeks ago. Anyway, next one. This Albert Chavannes is kind of a little bit an outfield sort of addition to our literary heritage, but he represents the mid-century immigration to Knoxville. He was born in Switzerland and came over, as a lot of Swiss did, mostly fleeing religious persecution to America. He was a French-speaking family, but he grew up here. And the first time I ever wrote about him, I thought I was probably the only one who'd ever heard of him. But I understand it sounds like he has kind of a cult following now. As you see, he's on Wikipedia too. But he was kind of a dreamer, although he was connected to the family, and they had a lumber mill, and he was connected to that lumber operation for a while. He was a dreamer about a better life, perhaps somewhere else, and he wrote a couple of utopian, kind of science fiction-ish novels set in a place called Socioland in Africa, which is and this is one of them that you can see on the right there. It's called In Brighter Climes, and I think the fact that it's called I'm trying to see Forgotten Books indicates that this is a recent publication of this book that I assumed was out of print and didn't exist anymore, but it's out there again. But In Brighter Climes is about a kind of a socialist utopia in Africa where a lot of where there's free love and everybody shares their wealth. But he was an idealist in that regard and embarrassed some of his family members. But he wrote these things and from his home here in Knoxville, and was actually had his own printing press off of Fourth Avenue, and eventually got some national attention before his death. He did this mostly toward the end of the last 15 years or so of his life, that he was really writing a great deal. But an interesting and odd character that I encourage you to look deeper into. Next one, please. All right, yeah, here's Adolph Ochs. Yeah, we got and we got the three papers that he's known for: the Knoxville Chronicle, the Chattanooga Times. He went down to Chattanooga at the age of 19 and was part of a consortium of people who bought the Times, and he became the editor of the Times and built it into a great paper. And he did the same thing with the New York Times, which was a failing paper in 1896, but he bought it and really made the Times what we know today as the New York Times in several respects. And that motto, "All the news is fit to print," is his idea. But as I say, he knew a lot of the people we've been talking about here. Next one. All right. While this is a little bit of an outlier, we chose to include this because Thomas Hughes never lived in Knoxville, but he was here for a few days. He was an Englishman. He was a member of Parliament, and he wrote a novel called Tom Brown's School Days that was extremely popular in England, and then became extremely popular in America. And I thought, in the wake of the Alabama game, I should mention this. This is the first time that Americans had ever seen any depiction of a sport kind of like football. This is the sport of rugby. Hughes was from the rugby school, and he describes this new game that they began playing that has punting and field goals and all these things that have become part of American football. But he came here in 1880, right about the time that football was kind of catching on in America. And of course, rugby. Hughes was also the guy that founded the rugby community in the Cumberland Mountains. So he has a lot of interesting connections for one fellow. But I think that this is the first time in Knoxville, at least, that people were really aware of football, and they made a point of including a copy of this book when they had a big reception for him at the Cowan Mansion on Kingston Pike, the place with the gardener's cottage in back. They had a big reception for him and had this book, Tom Brown School Days, featured as kind of on a pedestal that people could have their drinks and look around, and there's this book. If you want to see it, there it is, including this illustration of a very early English rugby football game. And you see the goalposts in the back, not unlike the ones that were torn down in Neyland Stadium the other day. But I just want to mention that this shows the influence of literature even among people who may not even read, but this a lot of aspects from literature do enter the culture, and I think football was one of them. Next one. All right, this another bit of an outlier. Tennessee Williams did not live in Knoxville, didn't work here. He visited frequently because his family lived here. His father was from here. He had two aunts who lived here and several other cousins, and they came back frequently when he was a child. And I've run across several mentions of his family coming from St. Louis to Knoxville. in the early days. This grave to the left is that of his grandmother, Belle Coffin, wife of Thomas L. Williams. And if you know anything about Tennessee Williams, you know his real name is Thomas Lanier Williams III. Belle Coffin's husband was Thomas Lanier Williams II, so he's named for his grandfather. This rather elaborate grave is very near the very plain graves of her husband, who died several years later, and Tennessee Williams' father, who's buried at Old Gray too, Cornelius Coffin Williams. But as is his Aunt Ella, who was an interesting lady who ran an eccentric gift shop downtown that Williams himself said partly inspired The Glass Menagerie, his first major play, about the disabled young girl who's preoccupied with her glass menagerie. He said it was based on his sister Rose, who spent a lot of time in Knoxville going to kind of ill-fated debutante balls and things here, and became preoccupied with this glass menagerie that his Aunt Ella had given her. Anyway, we have in the booklet, we have some stories about how Williams's plays were introduced to Knoxville, both through Knoxville High School and also an early production, a single night production at Bijou Theater. And his father, Cornelius Coffin Williams, and short descriptions of him mainly indicate that Cornelius did not approve of Tennessee Williams, but it was a complicated relationship. And it's interesting that Cornelius came out publicly and went to his son's plays when they were presented here in Knoxville, and also his son's movies, and would say nice things about them when people asked. So it was it's interesting that Tennessee Williams came to Knoxville one of the last times. I think he came here again later, but in 1957 when his father died, and was here at Old Gray Cemetery to see the burial, and describes it actually in one of his essays called "The Man in the Overstuffed Chair." Next one, please. All right, Anne Armstrong is an interesting lady that whose name you may be less familiar with. She wrote a book called "The Seas of God," although it was officially published anonymously. It was a little bit scandalous. It had to do with adultery and the teaching of evolution. But it was published in 1915 on both sides of the Atlantic. Was actually compared to Anna Karenina by some reviewers, and later on a book set in smaller places in Appalachia, This Day and Time. But Anne Armstrong was from up north Michigan, I think, originally, but she and her family lived in Fort Sanders and on Clinch Avenue. And she describes this area and growing up in Knoxville in a book that I've heard about for many years called Of Time and Knoxville. This is a memoir, the most vivid memoir of the Victorian era. And thanks to a woman named Linda Barrett, who's been working on this for years, this memoir is going to be published perhaps in December of this year by UT Press. It's a fascinating thing. I've been bugging Linda to get this out for a long time because I want to start quoting it. It's frustrating to read old history and you see a lot of political stuff back and forth that doesn't matter anymore, but you don't know what they ate for lunch, and that she describes things like that. She describes what things looked like and smelled like and tasted like in Knoxville in the 1880s. One of the most interesting times in Knoxville history when the place was becoming a real city. But she became notable as a business scholar. Was I think the first woman to lecture at Harvard Business School. But occasionally popped off a novel, fascinating lady, and kind of representing this late Victorian period in terms of Knoxville literature. Next one, please. All right, this is a guy that was a neighbor of hers. In fact, she did know him. She was older than he was. Bernadette Schmidt, who was a writer, not a fiction writer, but a historian. And he wrote this book, The Coming of War, 1914, in 1930. It was a book about the beginning of the of World War One, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. So James Agee is not the only Pulitzer Prize winner who grew up in Fort Sanders. If that's a ever a Jeopardy question, the answer is the other answer is Bernard Schmidt. He lived on White Avenue. Was kind of perplexed that UT almost tore down his house. They allowed it to be moved. So the Bernard Schmidt house, which was his father, Cooper Schmidt, was a UT professor, had lived there also, but it was moved over to Clinch Avenue about 10 years ago, but it's still standing. But an interesting fellow. The only another Jeopardy question is who is the only Knoxvillian ever to spend the day with Kaiser Wilhelm, and that is Bernard Schmidt. He went over there in the late 20s and found that Kaiser Wilhelm was still alive, kind of forgotten, living out in exile in the country, and he just spent the day with him and described it in this book, The Coming of War, 1914. Next one. And another neighbor, and this guy lived just around the corner from Bernard Schmidt, Joseph Wood Crouch. He was much younger than Anne Armstrong, so they probably didn't know each other, but I bet he knew Bernard. I'm almost certain that he knew Bernard Schmidt. But he was a National Book Award winner. He was not a fiction writer. He wrote essays. He wrote biographies. He wrote books of philosophy. Some of them controversial and interesting for that reason. But he ended his career the last 20 years or so as a naturalist, as a writer about nature. He was a UT grad, lived in New York most of the shank of his career, and was a drama critic for a long time. But he moved to Arizona and ended up writing a lot about the desert wildlife that a lot of people didn't know existed, and became one of the kind of the avatars of environmentalism in the 1940s and 50s. So a really interesting fellow. Crouch Park in downtown Knoxville is named because his brother, his older brother, Charles Crouch, when he died, left a surprise bequest to the city to establish a park to remind people of the nature just outside of city limits, and that's why we have a Crouch Park. But The Measure of Man is one of several of his books, but probably one of the best known of them. Anyway, an interesting fellow. Next one, please. And James Agee, another neighbor of those same people, grew up in Fort Sanders and was also so many things in his life, but he's best known to us, of course, Les Not Famous Men as a landmark of American journalism. A fascinating book about the Alabama sharecroppers, and there's never been a book like it in English language history. But A Death in the Family, of course, is his very different book, a very personal book about his own life. It's really hardly even a novel. It's almost an autobiography, but it was published as a novel with names changed. And it won the Pulitzer Prize, was made into a Broadway show called All the Way Home, which in turn was made into a movie. In fact, this book has been 4 feature-length films over the years, the last of which was a Masterpiece Theater adaptation of A Death in the Family. But a very influential guy, and the guy that when I was probably the first of Knoxville writers that people began paying a lot of attention to around the country, and began thinking about Knoxville because he describes Knoxville so well, and it describes his youth here so well, especially in Knoxville Summer 1915, which Samuel Barber, of course, the great composer in Pennsylvania, adapted into a very famous soprano piece. So his work, even though he died at age 45, his work has had a lot of legs and inspired a lot of people, and continues to today. As I say, the BBC came here just to do a story about James Agee in 1995, and we're kind of surprised to find how many Knoxvillians had never heard of him. But they did find one folk musician, a street musician downtown, a woman who had had worked up a folk music version of Knoxville Summer 1915, and they actually used that in their audio documentary, which was broadcast globally and won a big award that the following year at the Prix d'Italia or something like that. But it's hard to say enough about James Agee and his astonishing career. Unfortunately, there's very little of his life. Buildings associated with his life, of course, Market Square is still there, and St. John's Episcopal Church is still there. That was the church where his mother took him, and where he sang in the choir, and where he was baptized. So we still have that. Next one. All right, here, speaking of Market Square, this is I thought we'd have talk about a couple of things that when we did the literary guide, we found that some places have a lot of stories, so many stories that there are a couple of pages in the guide, and this is Market Square. In fact, this photograph was taken by a famous writer from Switzerland, Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach, 1937. This her work has not been very well known in America since then, because her book was published in German in 37 and was never well known here until people began kind of rediscovering her here lately. Anyway, a great picture. You see the old Market Hall in the background. It's gone, but on the left, you probably recognize the Oliver Hotel, which was the current building. Back then, it was the Ledgerwood Studios on the second or third floor, which had dance lessons. This is the time of Astaire and Rogers, and they had a big dance floor up there. But Market Square, for whatever reason, and because it's where everybody gathers, has inspired one writer after another over the years. Beginning with Anne Armstrong, who has several scenes in Market Square in her book, The Seas of God. 1915 has James Agee describes it in Death in the Family in great detail. His quotations about Market Square are engraved on the square, along with those of David Madden and Cormac McCarthy. And nobody's written more about Market Square than Cormac McCarthy in both his novels, Suttree and The Orchard Keeper, which has a really rich description of the square as it was in the early 40s, about 10 years before the setting of Suttree. Anyway, it's a fascinating place, and I have to say it's kind of regrettable that the things that have made it interesting to writers in the past have been the fact that it always seemed to be kind of in a state of decay and kind of a state of disorganization. And I'm not sure whether the Market Square as it is today is likely to inspire novelists as it did in the first 60 years of the 20th century. So it's interesting, but also there are other literary connections to this place too. That same building in the background there that Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach captured in her camera is the building where Elizabeth Gilbert, a modern writer who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, she was living there when she finished her most famous novel, or most famous memoir, Eat, Pray, Love, and actually named it. And while she was living in that place, she was here for just a semester while she was teaching at UT before she became really famous. So this is, and I mentioned Adolph Ochs earlier. It's literary in so many ways, Market Square. There's not a more literary spot in East Tennessee without any question on my part. But anyway, fascinating place. Next one, please. And here's the other place that we found. We had a whole lot, kind of a backup of stories for somebody that we kind of strained the page count, is the Andrew Johnson Hotel. There's so many interesting writers who've been associated with this place in one way or another, including Kurt Vonnegut, believe it or not, who lived in Knoxville in the early 1940s as he was attending the university on some wartime program. And the main thing he remembered about Knoxville was drinking beer at the Andrew Johnson Hotel. But Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach stayed there when she was here in Knoxville. She mentions it in her essay about the city. But it's had several other connections. But I even bring this up into the modern time. I mentioned people like Rachmaninoff and Hank Williams, of course, songwriter, composer, and songwriter, because they count as writers. Stayed here both in tragic circumstances. Rachmaninoff after the last concert of his career, and Tennessee Williams on the last night of his life. But then later on, Whittle Communications was there, and this was where the late Bill Rukeyser worked when he was in charge of Whittle Books, which was publishing John Kenneth Galbraith and George Plimpton and people like that. And George Plimpton was actually in this building helping with working on the book that he wrote for Whittle Books. So it's got a lot of, and it's described in some other books as well, but it's got a lot of literary heritage as well. Also, Jean Paul Sartre, I mentioned. I don't know if I mentioned him or not, but he stayed here in 1945 when he was on a French journalism junket writing about the war effort in America. So lots and lots of stories. Next one, please. All right, there's Sartre there on the right. He wrote a book. He wrote an essay called American Cities while he was staying at the Andrew Johnson for about a week in I think January of 1945, in which he observed that American cities seemed to be dying in the middle and kind of growing in the rings around the middle, which was certainly the case then, but very early in that suburbanization period. But on the left is Carl Sandburg, who was in Knoxville several times, sometimes to lecture at the university. He was here back in the early days of the Summer School for the South at UT campus, when school teachers from around the country would come to UT just to hear interesting writers and speakers and lecturers. He not only spoke and read his poetry, the Chicago poet, but he also played banjo, and he considered himself a good banjo performer. But he was here, like as I say several times, he was here in 1924 when he claimed to have written a whole chapter of his massive biography of Abraham Lincoln, called and part of the Prairie Years, that section of the biography. That he wrote a chapter of that in a Gay Street newspaper office on a borrowed typewriter while he was here for an event at UT. But he was a good friend of John Hodges and would stay at his house in Sequoia Hills when he was in town, but loved Market Square and would go to Market Square to just to sense the life. Of course, you may know that Carl Sandburg was famously from Chicago, but he lived his last 20 years or so in North Carolina, south of Asheville, and he would make the trip over here. I think Knoxville may have reminded him a little bit of the Chicago of his youth, just the urban density and the smoke and the crowds and the farmers market and all that stuff. But he was very fond of the farmers market and was protested the proposal to tear down the old market hall. But next one. And here's, of course, Cormac McCarthy, early picture of him. Born 1933, was born in Rhode Island, but did not. His father was an attorney and moved here in 1937 when Cormac was about 4 to take a job at TVA. But he essentially grew up in Knoxville. He lived in Sequoia Hills early on. The family lived on the south side of the river over near Sevier Avenue for a while, but later had a place on off in deep South Knoxville. Is it Martin Mill Pike out there? But he began his writing career here, and partly based on things that he observed in South Knoxville especially, but also in downtown, as you know from Suttre, which is essentially a downtown Knoxville version of Joyce's Ulysses, perhaps, as some people have described it. But describes Knoxville in such detail that it has inspired people to come here from all over the world to see if this is a real place that he was writing about. The Orchard Keeper was his very first novel, published in 1965, and it's set mainly in the countryside, but there's a long section that's about Market Square that's definitely worth reading. And I think we have excerpts from both of those in the literary guide. But fascinating guy. He moved out west in the 70s, and everybody thought he was out there until a journalist tried to find him in around 1980 and found out that he was living in a motel in Bearden, and as he did for a couple of years when he was working on the famous Blood Meridian. He apparently wrote a lot of that novel in a motel room in Bearden, and was known to wander around Homburg Place there. Homburg Place was fairly new, and it had a big bookstore, Draper's Books, and he would go in there usually when there was not anybody else there, and would browse around. But a fascinating guy, still alive. He's turning 90 next year, and just published his another book, The Passenger, to be followed by another novel, Stella Maris, later this year. The Passenger was just excerpted in the New York Times about a week or two ago, and it included a great quote that I'd heard rumored, that even though The Passenger is set largely in New Orleans, one of the characters is talking about Knoxville. And he says, does Knoxville create crazy people, or does it just attract them? But that's kind of a prevailing theme in a lot of McCarthy's work. Of course, he's won the Pulitzer Prize, and a lot of movies have been made from his work. The Road is the Pulitzer Prize winner, and even though, as was the case with Francis Hodgson Burnett, he talks about he writes this story that has no proper names in it, no proper nouns. So you don't know exactly where he is, but you can tell in the road when they come to Knoxville, because the father wants to show his son where he grew up, and he describes Knoxville and walking out to the house, and describes the house in South Knoxville where Cormac McCarthy spent most of his youth, in great detail. But anyway, we have a bit of a quote from the road in the guide. Next one. All right, David Madden actually helped with the guide. He lives in Black Mountain now. Incredibly, David Madden, Cormac McCarthy, and Richard Marius were born the same week in July 1933. And also equally remarkably, they went to UT at the same time and never met each other. They all studied literature, and I'm sure had some of the same teachers, but none of them will admit to ever having noticed any of the others at UT in the 1950s. But David Madden wrote several, he's written a lot of books. Cassandra Singing is one of his best known, but Bijou came out in 1974, I believe, got a lot of attention when it came out. Stephen King, of all people, took out a big space in the New York Times to write an essay about how great a book Bijou was. It's a coming of age novel, very thick novel about Knoxville, a kid in Knoxville in 1946. You can see what Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake in there. This kid is preoccupied with movies, and he watches them at the Bijou, and he describes their relationship with the Bijou and the other theaters. Unfortunately, he regrets this, that he changed the names he changed some things about Knoxville, including the name of the city. He calls it Cherokee, and a few things, but the Bijou is described exactly as it is and was, and Market Square and a few other things are exactly as they were as he knew them, and as a kid of what 13 years old in 1946 when the novel was set. Um, but anyway, it's an interesting book. Not for everybody, is the case with Sartre as well. It's kind of gamey, and he uses a whole lot of movie titles that you may or may not recognize. I think he probably name checks 200 or 300 1940s movies in the novel. But an interesting and very quotable book. There's some wonderful paragraphs in that book that I'd like to quote, and we do quote a few of them in the guide. Next one, please. And here's Richard Marius, the other of that triumvirate of geniuses, more or less, who were born at the same time. Richard Marius was more of an academic than the others were. He taught history at UT, I believe, but then moved to Harvard in the mid 70s to teach creative writing. He'd already been publishing some novels at that time. I think The Coming of Rain was one of his first. I think it was the first one to get a lot of attention, at least. But a lot of his novels are set in the Knoxville area. Many of them more in his home was over near the Dixie Lee Junction area. But his father was Greek. He has an interesting perspective on kind of the East Tennessee countryside. But he became known as a biographer as well. He wrote about Thomas More and other people, wrote biographies. But he wrote at least 4 novels, and the last couple have some Knoxville scenes in them. So I'm sorry that he's left us, but an interesting fellow. Next one, please. And Nikki Giovanni, of course, she was born in Knoxville, 1943. Grew up in segregated Knoxville, and she became known in the 1960s as one of the most radical and scathing of the Black Power voices, poets of the time. She was very well known among the kind of the counterculture in the late 1960s. But interestingly, in these books of poems that have talk about so much that's wrong with America, she has a poem called Knoxville, Tennessee. And in this poem is about her family here and how warm and loving her family was and how they took care of each other. And this poem was plucked out of this book of radical poetry and made into a children's story and illustrated as a children's story. So that's what you see on the right there. But interestingly, she comes back to town once a year or so. She was here for big years early this year, and gave a very interesting talk. But she wrote a book called Gemini that has a long essay called 400 Mulvaney Street, which is really about her youth in Knoxville and youth in Black Knoxville on East Vine and Mulvaney Street, where her grandmother lived. She's an interesting member of this party of novelists, a poet, free verse poet to join the party. But glad that she's among them. Next one, please. All right, and Alex Haley, of course, is different from the others, very different from the others, because most of the others we talked about are people who grew up here, began their writing career here. He finished his career here. He moved here as an older man after he was already celebrated as the author of Autobiography of Malcolm X and Roots, of course, which is about his own family, and was moved here just because he made some friends here, and not long after the World's Fair, just spent the last 8 or so years of his life in the Knoxville area. He of course had the farm at Norris, and I got to spend the day with him up there once, working on a project about the Bill of Rights in 1990. Was it 1992 or it was not long before his death? But But he also had houses and had a condo across the river at one time, and also lived on Cherokee Boulevard for about 3 or 4 years. When People magazine came and did a profile of him, it showed him raking leaves in his front yard on Cherokee. So, but he did more speaking, lecturing, teaching here than writing, apparently. But he always said he was working on an Appalachian novel, but it hasn't been revealed. He may have thrown it out before he died. We don't know, but would love to see that. And George Washington Harris's High Times and Hard Times show up at sometime. There are lots of missing pieces of literature and missing pieces of the puzzle. But next one, please. And here's the statue of Haley at Haley Heritage Square. And they occasionally have literary events, especially organized by Beck Cultural Center. Went to one a few months ago there when Haley's nephew was there doing some readings. But fascinating place. This was originally the largest statue of an African American in the world, but it's been exceeded by the MLK statue in DC in more recent years. Next one, is that it, Paul? Do we have more? Yeah, we have a little bit more. Yeah, we do. Yeah, these are a few kind of outliers, I guess you could call them. On the left is there's a whole series of very funny and very good, I think, literary detective novels called The Highly Effective Detective. They're all worth reading. They're silly, but they're also occasionally get into real things. They're kind of fascinating combination of murder stories and humor. But they're all set in Knoxville. Richard Yancey was from Florida, I believe, but he lived here for many years as an IRS agent of all things. But set a lot of his novels here. He's very well known in the young adult market for writing fantasy and science fiction type novels. But this is kind of just something different he tried a few years ago. And but in the middle is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, who lived in Knoxville, began writing when she was here. And The Historian was a best-selling vampire novel. A lot of it set in Europe, a very thick novel. She lives in Asheville, last I heard, but she was a familiar figure at Lawson McGee Library some years ago. And on the right, of course, is Eat, Pray, Love. I mentioned earlier that Elizabeth Gilbert was living here and teaching at UT when she finished writing that book, which of course became a major motion picture with Julia Roberts, and she finished it, and actually refers to living at the Oliver Hotel in the sequel to this book, and describes the library, which later became the Peter Kern Library, which is now a bar. She thought it was haunted when she was living here. Next one, please. All right, and a few others kind of on the left is Men in Black. I apologize, I'm blank. It's in the book. Blanking on the name of the.
It's Lowell Cunningham.
Lowell Cunningham, who lived in Fort Sanders at the time that he conceived the Men in Black series as a comic book idea, and of course it became a series of motion pictures. But that's we wanted to include him in the thing as well, because he's a writer, a different sort of a writer, but one who's had a big national influence. In the middle is Carl Wagner, who has a cult following, at least. Learned about him through a friend, but he is pretty well known among people who love horror and kind of fantasy. But he lived here. He was the son of Aubrey Wagner, the well-known TVA director for many years, but made a completely different career of his own. Aubrey Wagner's was the guy who was always facing controversy over the Tellico Dam and all that, but his son was doing completely different things. And on the right is Pulp Fiction, which is one of the best known movies of Quentin Tarantino, who was born in Knoxville and has visited occasionally and referred to Knoxville on a few kind of interesting and puzzling occasions, especially in Pulp Fiction. So we thought we'd throw those in too. We have a little mention about Quentin Tarantino and A Memorable Night on Market Square not very long ago. But next one, please. Are we done? This is one of those things that's almost too big a subject to try to tackle in an hour, but appreciate you joining us. What we really hope to raise interest in not just brag about Knoxville, but to raise interest in these writers and perhaps get people to read their work and seek out other work that's similar. And I think it could only help to readers to know the setting and be able to read the book and connect it to Knoxville and know today.